Well, as part of Black History Month, I tricked myself into watching a documentary. So here we go. Uh, I did not know MLK slash FBI was a documentary. I looked up movies that are coming out this month. It's like, oh, this looks interesting. Threw it on the list. All everyone's like, oh, it's a documentary. Now, I have nothing against the genre on its own. It
I
just
was
like
gonna inquire about that.
I
I
don't like.
like a good documentary, especially a story driven one like this. And technically, your favorite movie of 2018 was a documentary.
Yes, but that's the exception, not the rule.
Oh, I see.
It's like on average, I just don't find documentaries that engaging. I kind of tend to drift a lot watching documentaries.
I
Uh,
still say you need to watch Three Identical Strangers.
I'm sure I'll get to it eventually, but it's just like if I'm gonna look up a genre, that's usually the very bottom of my list. Nothing against the genre itself, just not my personal favorite. Uh,
Okay.
so on that note, MLK slash FBI is about exactly what it sounds like. It's a history of FBI surveillance on Martin Luther King. Um, what were your thoughts on this movie, just to start off?
I thought it was excellently executed. Um, I I liked the pacing and the music choices. Yes, I know I've been saying that a lot lately.
I don't feel like I'm
Uh,
going to critique you on that, Sarah.
oh, what?
I don't feel like we're going to critique you on how you're critiquing things. That's like going like, man, he talks about characters a lot. What an ass. It's
I
part of the movie. It's warrants discussion. But go ahead.
I appreciated the use of archival footage to move the narrative along with the commentators, mostly scholarly people who have, I'm guessing, made their careers studying these
Mm-hmm.
topics. And yeah, I thought it was a very moving and thought provoking film
Mm-hmm.
that happens to be a documentary.
I would say, at least my opinions on it. I have some kind of mixed feelings on this. As a documentary, it is very well structured. It's very well paced. All that stuff,
Hmm.
all the pieces work together very well. I think my biggest gripe with it, and I only know this because I've just been studying it more recently, which makes me like, oh, I know everything, but that's not what I'm trying to say here. Um, is the fact that I do take issue with the narrative that this is pushing, and it's kind of contradicted by the very end of the film too, which I thought was a little bizarre. And let me explain what I mean. This movie heavily implies, doesn't explicitly say, but heavily implies until the last 5 minutes of the movie that a lot of the dissent regarding Martin Luther King and kind of like his fall from grace was heavily driven by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Not now Edgar Hoover, bad man. Not gonna defend his character in any way. Things they did at the FBI, shitty,
Very,
horrible things.
very controversial figure who basically was the FBI for 40 years,
Yes, but I think my
40
issue.
pivotal years in American history.
Yes, but I think my issue with it is the fact that they kind of try to frame it as if one that the FBI was kind of a rogue agency under Hoover for majority of it. Again, until the very last 5 minutes of the movie where they say no, it wasn't. And then Hoover was kind of the mastermind behind this whole thing. Now, the reality of the situation is that the public was turning on Martin Luther King way before the Civil Rights Act even passed. That's kind of the issue I take with this movie, is the fact I feel like while it is presenting facts, I think it is presenting facts without the full context of those facts.
That's fair. I mean, a lot of documentaries sort of use that technique, and a lot of filmmakers use that technique to, shall we say, selectively edit to for storytelling purposes.
Yes,
But
like here's why I think it's a problem, though, especially in regards to this topic, Martin Luther King,
mhm.
is the fact that once again, like many other stories like this, it is trying to portray the problem of dismissing Black voices and Black movements as a minority group that had a lot of power. while dismissing the fact that it wasn't just the FBI or Hoover, it was also the media also lambasted Martin Luther King during the original marches as well.
They do touch on that with some interview clips that
Very, very briefly, but it's
they
implied
show.
that wasn't during the marches, though. That was after the Civil Rights Act was passed. Again, that's kind of the problem. They kind of imply that, again, they don't overtly say this. This might be my own conjecture on what they're saying here. But it seems to imply that everyone was kind of on board with the marches and the nonviolent protests and
Yes,
everything going up to civil rights. That was not true. That simply wasn't true. And that's why I think when I found out when I was researching for Superman Smash the Klan, because you have to do a lot of look for historical context, and you can find like old cartoonists and newspaper clippings and articles that also described his nonviolent marches as causing riots and violence, much like the
yes,
BLM is done today. And I take issue with not including that fact in here because it is an important fact. They only include that stuff in this documentary after the Civil Rights Act was passed and the Voter Rights Act was passed in 1965. But they omit this stuff, and I feel like that does the story detriment. Because that implies that the FBI and Hoover largely did a lot of the shit talking on MLK. But the hate feelings were already there. Hoover and the FBI just kind of capitalized on it. And I think that's a missed opportunity to explore. Do you see? You got what I'm
it
saying?
is. Yeah, I do, and it's a legitimate, well taken point. I'm not dismissing or disagreeing with it.
Oh no, I'm not. I'm not
I
saying you
guess
are.
I guess upon viewing, I didn't go deep down that investigative hole.
And I'm sorry,
Um,
it's not meant as like a personal
but
attack kind of thing. I apologize for coming off that way. Uh, if it
it's
makes you
okay.
feel better, same thing with Grant with Trial of Chicago 7. Makes it is not a personal reflection on you in any way. This is just more like, okay, the history that's being presented here is not being presented correctly, and I think it does so to the movie's detriment in terms of informing people about this part of history.
Well, yes, and I think it's pretty easy to find any staunch conservative from any era, particularly the height of the 20th century civil rights movement, uh, to find staunch conservatives who were and still are very much opposed to it, and and they will have their opinions about how the peaceful protests will lead to violent rioting. One thing that crossed my mind as I was watching it was much of, not all of it, but much of the violence that was provoked was from the white police officers who
Yeah,
sprayed hoses on the peaceful protesters.
and that was plan.
Yes.
MLK very much understood that non-violence and peaceful are not the same thing.
No.
So like in this case, and that was again what drew division across the division along like party lines in regards to the civil rights movement. Fun fact, actually, this is something I found out recently, and I've been using this information ever since because it is so juicy and so easy to bring up in arguments about this. Is the fact that Democrats were actually the far more conservative group at the time.
Yeah, the Dixiecrats.
Yeah, the Dixiecrats. Up through up
as they were
until the Civil
nicknamed.
Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act is what began the societal shift or the political shift in parties. Because if you look at the numbers, like Democrats on the whole supported the Civil Rights Act largely because of Kennedy and Johnson. But what happened is like Southern Democrats vehemently opposed it. Like I think only like 5% of Southern Democrats voted for it. But just the fact that it still received bipartisan support pissed off the South so goddamn much that conservative Republicans, who were in the minority at the time, seized that opportunity to take hold in that area. Um, and I'm not saying you don't know this, but for those who want to ever brings up that, well, you know, the Democrats started the KKK. Use this information. It is so juicy, uh, and so satisfying when they don't know what to say afterwards. Um, but but that anyway, the point is that basically shifted conservatives to the right and Democrats to the left, and which eventually was solidified by the time Reagan took hold and started the war on drugs.
Yep.
Um, so
So,
there's a
uh,
related unrelated fact, but go ahead. Sorry.
so what I found interesting about the story told in archival footage in this film was, well, it wasn't news to me that J. Edgar Hoover was concerned about the power that Martin Luther King and anybody who was in a racial minority could accumulate and nurture if they worked together, which of course they did. And so that I found it interesting how nervous that made J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, considering everything else that was going on in the world of politics around these times. And I really should do some research into J. Edgar Hoover's life, but I have heard bits and snippets about how his private life didn't match his public image, as it were.
I mean, who does life does really?
So I found it surprising and interesting, and honestly very dirty and underhanded, that the FBI would spend so much time and resources and manpower it basically putting Martin Luther King Jr. under surveillance and to basically emotionally blackmail him for being unfaithful to his wife, Coretta Scott King, who I think she might still be alive. At least she was. At least she was a few years ago, and it just seems like a rather juvenile tactic to put so much time and resources into. Like the most they could get on him was that he was unfaithful, and they tried to use that to emotionally blackmail him into committing suicide. And,
It's like the letter was surprising. I'll give him that. I didn't know what the letter. The FBI stuff on the most part I already knew. Let me finish my thought.
Sorry.
I think the underhanded stuff with the FBI, and everything they did, isn't really that surprising when you really consider the fact that pretty much since the discovery of America, the biggest threat to white people has been, and it still remains this day, black people with power. It has always scared them from from the 1800s to now. It's always been the case. Anytime there's any kind of black rising of power, there has always been an attempt to shut it down. We're still seeing it today, even now. So especially someone like Hoover, who was very much like an old time conservative by the movie's admission,
Mm-hmm.
would view that as a threat, not just MLK. He also considered like Malcolm X a threat. He had the FBI investigated him along with the Muslim community as well.
The Black
Uh,
Panthers.
yeah, I'm sorry, the State of Islam. I think it's called the Nation of Islam. That's what it's called.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the Black Panthers, anything that perceived as Black people having power, not power over them, but power equal to them, is seen as abhorrent and historically fought against tooth and nail at every possible conception. And I think that's again a kind of an opportunity. It's addressed at the very end of the movie, but I kind of wish it took center stage more in the actual narrative of the film, where they say like Edgar Hoover didn't act alone. He wasn't some like the FBI wasn't some rogue nation. They were a legitimate branch of the government. Therefore, everything they did was in some way sanctioned by the government, which implies correctly that the government has been and always will be threatened by Black people having equal power to white people. And like that has been like if everywhere you look, that has always just been the case. And I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know.
Yes.
To be clear. But I think at least that's the perspective I'm coming at this from. I completely agree. It was shitty. It was horrible. It was underhanded. But for me, it's not that surprising, which I know makes me sound hoity-toity and a bit pretentious. But it's more like when like any nothing is off the table outside of just right out assassination. Even that's kind of debatable in terms of stopping people that are considered a threat to white power. Like there, and that we draw comparisons to MLK's assassination possibly being some kind of government sanctioned job. Whether it is or
That's
not, that's a conspiracy. Completely up
yeah.
to debate.
That's a whole other can of worms, a whole other topic.
But I think this is something Ron pointed out to me, and I thought was very interesting. Is the fact that they didn't really go after MLK when he was talking about race. They came at him when he was talking about class. That's when they released. That's when
Yes.
the threat really elevated, and that's where in the second half of the movie they largely focus on how he was kind of blacklisted for that reason, or actively targeting more because of that reason, which is true.
And the documentary also makes a point of how um they came after him more, or his standing was less secure with his allies when he spoke out against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
and civilian children were being detrimentally hurt.
and that's definitely not.
Just just and it the documentary pulls no punches by showing pictures that were in a magazine that he read on his travels, and while he he was a complicated, imperfect man, he was also a very sensitive and feeling man who couldn't keep silence about the these terrible things that his country was involved in,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of severed his alliance with President Lyndon B. Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when his standing fell on shakier ground, and they came after him more, and like you were saying about class, when he was working on the poverty movements, which is still very much an issue today, if not more so.
I mean, Black Civil War, to be fair.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't insinuating otherwise.
Fair enough.
That's another reason why I wanted to talk about this movie this month, because many of the issues that MLK crusaded against in his time, that are depicted in this documentary, are still extremely relevant if not worse off now in many ways.
Like we're going back to
And
Johnson. I'm sorry. Did you have more you wanted to add to that?
just to preface that, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just somebody who's fascinated by history, and it's something that I feel passionately about.
Oh no, and suggesting otherwise. I'm not an expert either, even though I definitely act and talk like one.
Yes.
um, but I was like going back to Johnson though for a little bit. I'll admit I don't know a lot about him specifically. I did a little research after I watched this movie, so I can't say for certain whether or not it was the poverty case that did really break through that relationship. I know Johnson had a very complicated relationship with racism in America, mostly because he was raised in the South.
Yes.
Um, and but he understood it to an extent. Like there's a quote I was looking up earlier because I was trying to figure out the origins of it. Where he said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pocket for you." Now he wasn't saying this. Now he looked at the context for that because I was kind of curious, like, okay, where was that coming from? What was the full context? It was basically him explaining what racism in America means government wise to someone else in the room. And by that respect, he's completely right, and that's supported by history as well. Going back to again civil rights movement, um, where basically civil rights advocacy is actually what spawned the term law and order, which as people know was repeated back in BLM movement, which just always kind of supports my thesis of history just repeats itself if we don't learn from it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think it was started by Nixon. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But it all serves the exact same intended purpose either way, which it's not to demonize the movement or even just be overtly racist. It's to divide the poor community against each other, so that way they won't unite and get the bigger enemy. And that's something that Johnson very clearly understood, which is why he probably dissociated with MLK when the poverty thing started rising, because again, there's another perceived threat that needs to be shut down. Johnson, for as much as he did for civil rights advocacy, which he did a lot, like the Civil Rights Act and the Voters' Rights Act would not have passed without Johnson. He's still he's still at the end of the day still supporting the people that pay him, which is donors, bigger people like that. Now I don't know how big donor was that. So I mean that's not quite a fair statement to say because I don't know how much sponsorship money went into that time of the government history. So I redact that statement. My point remains. I'm done. Go ahead.
And one thing that I want to mention before I forget is at the very end of this documentary, they mentioned that the tapes and surveillance and FBI files pertaining to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will be unsealed pretty much 6 years from now in February 2027. And the commentators kind of gave their closing thoughts about how whether or not those files should be made public, as will it change or tarnish his legacy? If anything, I think that anybody who has really studied the subject already knows he was a complex and flawed human being like everybody else.
Yeah, I don't think it's stuck in really necessarily new, or like that isn't already kind of public knowledge if you're looking into it.
Exactly.
But continue.
And I personally think that it would be important for the sake of history and transparency for the files to be made public, if that is what is going to happen in 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it adds another layer of complexity to the this part of history in America. If anything, it might tarnish the legacy of the FBI a bit.
I feel like they've done that to themselves plenty.
However,
I feel like they've done that to themselves plenty.
yes, yes. Um, but especially now in in this modern world of 24/7 news, I again, as a fan of history, think that the government being transparent about a complex and dark chapter in its history may be important, kind of a an important change of pace.
Mm-hmm. I think kind of piggybacking off of that, and again, that kind of goes to my central issue with this film. And I still think it's a very good film. Don't get me wrong.
This,
Um, but just I know I don't want to repeat myself, but I think my biggest issue is the fact that at the very end of this movie, they do say like, oh, like I mentioned before, like the FBI wasn't some rogue agency. Hoover wasn't this, and it wasn't like they were okay with this, everyone was okay with this. No, it was much more complicated than that. And my issue with that is like, but you spent the last hour and 40 minutes framing it as if the FBI was this rogue agency and Hoover was the mastermind behind all of this. And I think to me that underscores the real thing that need to be talked about more, which is it's not just a government thing. It's not just the FBI. It's not just this, not just that. There's no single simple piece to blame for the things that are wrong. It's everybody and everything. The issue is systemic and societal.
yes,
And unless you take a stronger stance on that, you're never actually going to change it. But I don't. But at the same time, like I wonder, and this is like I have no way in confirming this, and it's like so I'm wondering is like with that in mind, what is the intention behind the documentary? If even contradicts itself at the end, it's still framing this as this hero and villain kind of story when it's not. Um, and I wonder this because it's something I've had to like call myself out on too. It's something I've been realizing recently, and something I kind of realized when I saw Queen and Slim last year, which is I've given a lot of movies in the about like police brutality a pass when they present like, oh, here are the good cops. Like, don't worry, guys. Here are the good cops, and here are the bad cops, and just the bad cops are the problem. And while that may reflect reality to a sense, the problem when you present the issue like that in that kind of black and white, good and evil kind of way, is it allows you to dismiss the parts that allow those bad parts to exist. And I guess that's why I'm more critical than I used to be about how we tell the stories for that very reason. Am I making sense there?
you are, and it's I I personally think that you being more critical and wanting them and wanting storytellers to explore the gray and the in between and the minutia and details. I think that that shows how much you you've grown
Thank
and so.
thank you, thank you. I appreciate you saying that because I always, you know me, I always feel bad when I get my high horse, even though I do it all the time. Uh,
Now, as a viewer of stories, I acknowledge that you using good guys, bad guys, black and white, it is easier storytelling
of course.
to tell and convey. But I I think there is a lot of room and a growing call for the more exploration of the gray complexities in these kinds of stories. Now, I enjoyed this documentary.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, ultimately, it focuses on two men that were more complex than they were than they appeared to be in their lives, and in this documentary itself.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, like I said, as a movie, as a documentary, and again, I'm kind of just parodying what I said for the Trial of Chicago 7 because I went on a similar, much angrier tangent uh, about that movie than this one. Is the fact like I have no issues with telling stories like good versus evil. God knows I write plenty of video essays about superheroes. I'd be a massive hypocrite if I wasn't okay with that form of storytelling. I my issue is more like if you're going to talk about police brutality, if you're going to try to talk about real world like actual events involving race, police brutality, societal issues, and these things that really fucking matter, and how you choose to present those in the modern day relevance is so goddamn important. And my feeling for that is like, if you're gonna do that, I feel like you need to take, or at least you should take, a braver stance and not be afraid to make audiences uncomfortable
Yes.
and face and really challenge them to face that uncomfortableness.
Yes. I
And that's what I really liked about Promising Young Woman, the movie we talked about last time, for that same
mhm.
reason. It's granted it's not a documentary. If I'm using it as an example because it does. It's a movie that definitely like shoves it in your face. Like, yeah, this shit is real. Look at it. And I think, especially in a documentary format, you owe it to your audience not to pull your punches, and resist that narrative temptation.
Yeah, I agree. Um I still think this is a solid standalone documentary film.
But I'm not saying
Uh,
it's
and there I'd say that if these are topics you're interested in studying or learning more about, this is a decent jumping off point.
mhm. I'll agree with that. By the way, I know I'm shitting on this movie a lot. I don't think it's a bad movie. I think it's more like you know that the meme, the Wonder Woman 2 meme, like the only good thing to come out of the Wonder Woman 2 movie, where it has the Mandalorian going, "Your life is good, but it could be better." That's kind of how I feel about this. Either that or like a overbearing mom. Like, I know you can do better. Like, it's good. It's a good start, but you can push yourself. You can do more. And that's kind of how I feel about this. I just feel like it's a good jumping off point for those who don't know a lot about the subject, who wanted more about it, and kind of start teasing those social relevancy stuff. But I felt like it could have really gone the extra step, and the pieces are there to do that. Um, so it's not like I'm not mad. I am disappointed it didn't reach its potential.
That's fair. I am glad that this rental wasn't as much as last week's.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes, I can recommend this movie. Yeah,
And I'd say this is worth renting it for $7.
yeah. Like I mean, it's good. It's a good way to start off Black History Month for sure.
Yes.
Um, I just think if you really want to understand this scenario, like the history behind a lot of this stuff, um, there are all other kinds of resources you can look up. I just there's still a lot. There's so many minutiae, so many angles to look into this, that go beyond
Yes,
the point.
and you you can read one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s books. I did that when I was at community college. Uh, you can look into articles from the time. You can probably look up some clips on YouTube. There are many sources to explore the different detailed angles of this important and complex story.
Hold on, I have a book here. Let me get rid of. Testing,
I
testing.
think
Okay.
okay, there you are.
So if you guys want a really good place to get an idea of where to start your history, your understanding of basically what it means to be a black man in America, I recommend Between the World and Me, by I can never say his name right. I'm going to butcher it. I apologize. By Ta-Nehisi Coates. Very fascinating book. It's basically an autobiography. It's written as like a memoir to his son. But he talks about basically living through the civil rights movement, or at least reflecting on the leaders of that time, in particular Malcolm X. In a very fascinating term, he talks about how white America raises up leaders like MLK for the nonviolent stance because they are afraid of what black people will do with violence more than anything else. Like white heroes are allowed to be violent, they're allowed to fight for freedom, they're allowed to this and this, but black people aren't. And I think it's a very fascinating dichotomy to examine. Um,
It is.
so Between the World and Me, I highly recommend it. I would also recommend the new Jim Crow, which is the examination of mass incarceration as the new form of segregation and
No,
second class citizenry. I can never say that right. Um,
economic
Fascinating book.
segregation is another part of that.
Yeah. It's basically how we basically target and label black people now without directly calling them the N word, in a more socially acceptable term. Another fascinating book. It also just goes over basically the entire history of racism in America. It's a very fascinating read. For me, it was very, very eye opening. I highly recommend it. Great stuff. So if you're looking for a jumping off point after you watch this movie, I recommend recommend reading those along as well. I have more books to mail, so hopefully, if you guys really want to know what the white guy thinks is the best books to read about racism,
And if you want to read one of Dr. King's books, why can't or why can't we wait is a good one. It's on my shelf somewhere over there. I'd go rummage for it, but that might take a minute.
you're good. Um, so yeah, I think it's I've said my piece. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that or
Just one more thing.
go for it?
Again, towards the very end, one of the commentators, who I think is a professor at Yale, um, talks about or briefly touches on uh, the mentality that the white man has towards African Americans, and and how they've always been nervous about their strength and power, and how it and how they've always been uh, worried about uh, basically the African American man displacing them as the powerful man in the country. And she mentions how there's a reckoning happening, that um, the the country and its citizens, the its white citizens, are going to have to reconcile the history of how they have thought of the African American throughout our nation's history, and that reconciliation is going to have to bubble up at some point. And I think that's what we've been experiencing, just little simmers of, in especially more and more in recent years. And I personally think that that it's rather sickening that how slow uh, the the conservative white man, and I'm not trying to lay blame or anything, just I'm I I personally feel rather sickened that it is taking so long for so much of this still relatively young country to grow and reconcile this very unflattering piece of its history and acknowledge it and learn and unify and grow. And that's that was one of my last takeaways from this movie that they briefly touch on at the very end.
I always think about what Ron told me a long time ago, where it said like slavery existed in America for over 100 years, and it could take over 100 years to work past all that. Now, as this movie points out, is the fact that the civil rights movement, for all intents and purposes, wasn't that long ago. There
No,
are
it wasn't.
people alive today that were there during those times. People that even like people like Martin Luther King, his children, his wife, probably, um, and other advocates at that time. Still very much remember those days now. So it's one of those cases where you really have to acknowledge the fact that not only was it not that long ago, but one thing that's often not reported about in history is the fact that it went on for a year and a half before any substantial changes were even close to being made. And that's the point of protest, not peaceful protest, but nonviolent protest, which is it needs to be law and it needs to be intrusive in order for it to succeed. It can't be something that can be ignored like a peaceful protest can. And that's kind of unfortunate reality of it. In fact, the fact of the matter is MLK's march had to be a gigantic pain in the ass for society before society actually did something with it. And I think that's what thing a lot of people misunderstand about the BLM movement is the fact like, oh, what, like, why can't they just protest like this, protest like that? It's like, because you ignored them when they protested like that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I honestly still wish he was still going. I don't know if it still is or to what extent, but like I wish it was still going now to the extent it was back in July, because again, that's the only way real change is gonna take place is if you don't go away.
It can't let up.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so I guess that's my closing thought. Again, white man trying to educate about how the black people should protest. It is not my place. This is all coming from a very limited pool of knowledge. If I am full of shit, please call me out on it.
Same. I acknowledge that I am a sheltered white woman. I acknowledge that I am dripping in white privilege. I just I am fascinated by history, and I consider myself to be an empathetic humanist. And I to quote Rodney King, can't we all just get along?
uh, yeah, if only it was that simple.
I know.
Um,
I know that it's not, but that's kind of what I strive for in my day to day life.
I hear you. I wish it was that simple too. Maybe one day it will, but probably not in our lifetimes, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, not. No. So
So,
I'm not claiming to be an expert. I am just an empathizer.
um, I guess one note I do kind of want to leave it on is one thing I do not understand, and it was my main thesis for the Superman Smash Clan video, which is I do not understand the obsession with trying to appeal to the white racist voter. That still to this day completely fucking baffles me. Especially again this most current election cycle, which by the way we cannot emphasize enough how goddamn close we came to just full on
I know.
fascism, and we're still close. I'm looking at like fucking Lady Marjorie over there with her Jewish space lasers and
Miss
her
QAnon.
uh ugh. um but anywho, that's another tangent for another day. Um but at the same time, I was also like, yeah, but let's completely honest here. Black voters saved our fucking asses. Stacey Abrams alone is a goddamn hero for single-handedly turning Georgia blue.
Yeah.
So
Like if I I will probably never have the opportunity or privilege of meeting this woman, but if I do, I will fall on my knees and kiss her feet I I owe my peace of mind to her.
Absolutely. So like keep in mind, like as much as white America likes to pretend that black people don't actually have power on there, they have more power because they're not willing to give it up. And it's because of that that change can and will eventually happen, even if it has to be kicking and screaming.
Yes.
That's I think where I will end it there. Um, Thank you guys for watching. I know this isn't our usual funny laugh and joke reviews, but to, it is very important to me. It is very important to you, and it is a very important topic to discuss, even if we're both white. So,
uh, if you feel like you need to correct me, by all means, I I welcome it. And
we can talk about some shitty movies soon. It's like we're going back in January. Where there's all the crappy movies that come out? Where's Bye Bye Man 2?
maybe maybe we're talking about good ones now. I don't know.
No, I heard all the little things on HBO is pretty bad, so I'll probably have to watch that one.
I have no desire to see that because the trailer keeps on coming up in my YouTube feed, and I'm so sick of it.
Yeah, I'll drag somebody to watch it. All right, thank you guys for watching. See you later.